Yeah, my hair's gone kind of wild. Whatever. All right. So the last two lists I did were science fiction and fantasy. And now I'm going to go into my horror lists. Full disclosure, horror is not my genre. Not necessarily because I don't like horror as an idea. It's just that there's not as many good horror movies that I find. There's not as many good horror movies as there are like good science fiction, good fantasy, and good dramas. I do like horror as an idea, though. I just wish there would be more good ones to go by. However, I do have a couple that I do find to be classics, and I do find to be elevated to the level of how I see science fiction and fantasy. So I'll kind of go over a couple of those. Number one is I've already talked about this on my science fiction one, is Alien. I think that's. I mean, if you've already seen my science fiction one, I've already gone over why I think it's a great movie, but also why it's a good horror movie specifically is that what they don't show you, what Alien, what it shows you in the darkness, what it and also not being too gory. There's a couple pretty brutal moments, especially the chest burster is one of the most graphic scenes in cinema history, but the rest of it is not super bad. It's just creepy, it's spooky, but it's also just such a good movie. So I won't go too much into that one. Number two, this one might divide of what constitutes as a true horror movie. I consider this to be a horror movie, even though it's more of a crime drama. There's enough horror elements in it that I would classify it as horror, and that is Silence of the Lambs. Um, for one thing, it's just a great movie. It's a great tense crime mystery, while this level of just absolute horror is underneath it. First of all, you got two villains in this movie. One guy is, obviously, uh, whatever his name is, Anthony Hopkins' character, as this cannibal who's in confinement, but we get to hear about his past, and then later in the movie we get to see him actually eating people. And there's a great sequence of his escape that becomes pretty much a true horror, kind of a slasher thing almost. But on top of that, we get the main villain of the movie, which is the Buffalo Bill or whatever his name is, um, the guy who's skinning women and wearing their suits. Very disgusting, very horrifying, and the whole time he's got a woman trapped in this little hole in the ground. And towards the end of the movie, there's a great sequence of main character Jodie Foster's character searching around a basement with him in the pitch darkness, and him just being like right there beside her without her knowing that he's there. Very tense. So yeah, I would truly say it is a horror film, just not as not based on supernatural or anything like that, but it's horror. Number three is Jaws. Once again, not truly a horror film. It's more of a thriller, adventure thriller. But again, there's just enough horror elements in there that I think anything that frightens me, I would consider horror. And I would put like Jurassic Park in the same thing. I think Jurassic Park would be horror too. But if we're talking Spielberg horror, I would say Jaws is probably the most that would signify horror. And once again, doesn't deal with the supernatural. It deals with a real animal. Granted, something that's much probably bigger than what in the real world there would be giant, great white sharks. But still, a very grounded, very good dialogue, great characters. Another one of those. Steven Spielberg must like the 4-act structure because it's one of those movies that you get on land. You get these 2 acts where the setup and then the trying to solve the mystery of who the shark is, which shark is responsible for all these killings. And the midway point, they find out that they didn't catch the real shark. The real shark is still out there, and so the next half of the movie is out to sea. So it becomes like an adventure film, and it's just a great movie. I think it's one of Spielberg's his best. It's certainly his best of the '70s. I would say second would be probably Close Encounters, but yeah, out of his movies from the '70s, Jaws is just right out of the gate too. I think it was his third film, but it was still his first movie that was like a mainstream success, and he basically invented the modern blockbuster film just from one movie. So Yeah, Jaws, absolutely. Number four is going back to Stanley Kubrick with The Shining. This movie is dark, it's creepy, it's got great cinematography. Um, I think it's spooky as hell. I, I have an odd view about it because, in one aspect, and this is kind of the thing about most Kubrick movies, it's really hard to like separate the performances being realistic or over the top because there's some really over the top performances in this, but there's the way he shoots these over the top performances, especially by Shelley Duvall. It's enough that it doesn't distract. It doesn't make it hokey. In fact, in some ways, I think it elevates the horror. But yeah, so Shining has some of the best like horror cinematography that I've seen, aside from like Alien. A lot of like sweeping shots with like a steady cam, wide angle lenses, slow zooms, just very visually. It's a really interesting movie. But I think most people have seen The Shining, so there's not much more to say about it. But still, number four, regardless. Number five is The Exorcist. Um, I might actually put this. I might actually switch these two. I might actually put this as my number four because it's a genuinely terrifying movie. Just the idea, the way their the sequence of events slowly leading towards the ending is so tense. You know that something bad is happening, and just kind of slowly builds up to that. And it accurately shows what a mother would go through if she finds out her daughter was possessed by Satan, and you can really see the terror and the horror in her face when she's seeing what her daughter is doing and what her daughter is becoming. It's intense, man. So I would say that's one of the best in terms of demon horror or supernatural horror. That's up there. That's a straight up perfect horror movie. In some aspects, I think it's not for everyone because it is dark and it is brutal. I think the most disturbing part about this movie is that all these terrible things are happening to a 12-year-old girl. That makes it a lot more because when you're dealing with adults, being having going through this stuff, it's already scary in its own. But I think having it done to a child just makes it infinitely more terrifying. So, Exorcist. Number six would be Psycho. Once again, more of like a psychological thriller in a way, but there's definitely some the elements of early precursor to slasher movies in this. I think a lot of slasher movies that kind of started coming up in the 70s, Halloween, and after that, they got the Friday the 13th. I think a lot of them have Psycho to thank for that. And I think it's just a really very solidly made movie, especially for 1960s when it was made. There had really been nothing like that since then, or up until that point. When people thought of like a horror movie, it's more of like a haunted house. This one got into some dark territory. The fact that he's like spying on her while she's like getting undressed, and the fact that he's dressing as his mom, it gets psychologically, it's a very dark movie for its time. I mean, nowadays you can look back and say, okay, that wasn't that bad. There wasn't any graphic gore scenes. The shower scene, I think what the movie is most notorious for, really isn't as horrifying as what it's implying. We don't really see too much of the actual stabbing motion. We see the stabbing motions, but we don't actually see like her getting what I mean. It's not as dark as it could have been. Made today, I'm sure they would have made it like shown like rape scenes and graphic violence. Modern movies they go way too far. But back in the day, this was considered pretty edgy. So that's definitely certainly the best horror movie of that era up until that point. Number seven is, I've already talked about this on my science fiction list as well, is The Thing, and I won't repeat myself, but yeah, that's a great aside from a great science fiction movie, great horror movie. Plenty gross out effects, plenty of jump scares and all that good stuff. Everything you want out of a good body horror movie is in The Thing. Number eight is I talked about this on my fantasy list, but it firmly belongs in the horror genre. Is King Kong. Yeah, it's a scary giant gorilla chasing people through a jungle, and then the scene that when I was a kid freaked me out was when the explorers are going into the jungle and they get on that raft, and suddenly there's this diplodocus or a brontosaurus coming out of the water, stalking him, and it tips them over, and all the people start falling off the boat, and he just starts picking them up one by one and eating them. And eventually, it chases them up on land, and this guy crawls up a tree for some reason. Like, if you're being chased by a dinosaur with a long neck, wouldn't that be the last place you'd want to go, into a tree? Maybe just fear madness. Maybe he got so afraid he just decided to climb up a tree. But when he gets eaten by it, I remember now as an adult, I can think it's kind of funny. But as a kid, hearing him screaming as the dinosaur was eating him terrified me, because he was really, really high pitched screaming. And nowadays, it's really funny to me. But as a kid, it just disturbed me. Like, why are these people screaming so high pitch? Why are all these men voices are like screaming like children? And it just, for some reason, just really disturbed me. But as an adult, I find it pretty funny. So actually, the log sequence when they're falling over and when they're falling off the bridge. And again, this is for its time, it was terrifying. Nowadays, it's kind of funny when you see like the dummies hitting the ground, and then one like hits like a rock and like bounces. They were like literally ragdolls. But effects aside, again, this is a movie that's almost 100 years old, so I'm not going to rag on it too hard about its effects. But it still is a great movie, great horror movie, great monster movie. So yeah, King Kong. Number 8, I'm going to doing one of my combined entries on this one is the Evil Dead series. I don't know which one I like the most. They're all great. But yeah, the first one is a great, like, straight up horror film. Like, even though there's some comedic moments in it, it doesn't like take them too seriously. And it's just so over the top and gory that it almost becomes comedic. But it's not. That's the thing about the first one, is that it's not clear if they're trying to be funny or it just kind of like that just kind of happened as they were doing it. It ended up being funny. Either way, it's a great one. Then number 2 came in Evil Dead by, I think it was Evil Dead by Dawn. I think that's the official title of it. I'm not sure. Evil Dead 2 is they embrace the comedy part of the horror, and then just go, you know what, we're just going to make this ridiculous and just make it, like crazy wide angle zooming and camera reversing speed, way over the top effects. The first one had some effects that are pretty brutal, but this one just goes all out and just makes it as ridiculous as possible. But I think this one actually might be my favorite, is Army of Darkness, because it ditches the horror element of it and it becomes more of a fantasy adventure. But that's why I wouldn't really consider that a true horror film. So it doesn't really belong on this list. But it is still just so fun. It is, I think, one of the movies that I think I've gotten the most out of my style from, with like the wide angle lenses and the sweeping zooming shots and the twisting camera work, Dutch angle stuff. So on a filmmaking level, it's just a goldmine of inspiration. But it's also just an entertaining movie. It's funny, got some great lines, yeah. So, but again, I'm not sure if I would consider that a horror film. My number 10 spot would be Steven Spielberg and Tobe Hooper's Poltergeist. I think that one is just, in terms of ghost movies, aside from The Shining, that's can't get much better than that. There's some horrifying effects in that movie, especially the scene where the guy starts ripping his face off in the mirror. When I saw that, I'd never heard of it when I first saw that scene. I was in a hotel room, and I turned on the TV, and that's the scene that showed up. And just of someone tearing off their face. And since I didn't have any context of why that was happening, I just thought, like, oh my God, I'm just watching some person lose their mind and rip off their face. And I was traumatized for years, until when I was a teenager, I finally got to see the actual movie, and I'm like, this is awesome. This is great. Some really cool effects towards the end of the movie. The climax of the movie, just like, they have like stop motion miniatures, and the house gets sucked into the portal. Just fun. So that's my top 10 list. Alien, Silence of the Lambs, Jaws, Shining, Exorcist, Psycho, The Thing, King Kong, and Evil Dead, and Poltergeist. So, but here's a couple other ones that I wanted to talk about. That in no particular order, they're just horror movies that I enjoy. Frankenstein, the original Frankenstein. In fact, I'll kind of go through a couple of the older 1930s, the Universal monster ones. Frankenstein specifically, because I think that really, that's when horror, that was kind of like the first of the horror. I think Dracula might have been first, But this was like the first one uh, that really started. That kind of created the Universal monster franchise. Really short movie. It's only about like 60 or 70 minutes, but a tight little narrative. Then you have, of course, Dracula, which I have not seen actually. And then there's the Mummy, another great one. Bride of Frankenstein, Wolfman, um, Creature from the Black Lagoon. So yeah, those the Universal monster movies. I felt like I would piss off a lot of people if I didn't mention those in a top list. The thing about those movies is that they are products of their time. You know, they're not like cinematic masterpieces by any means. There's some pretty hokey effects, pretty hokey acting in those movies. But I still think horror and filmmaking in general owes a lot to those movies. So always acknowledge where talent is given to us. So another one would be this one is more of a psychological horror, psychological thriller, but it's a great movie. It's Jacob's Ladder. This one of those more movies that got me really into the style of filmmaking, like learning about like editing, especially. Great pace, great, really creepy imagery. I had never at that point I had never seen anything the way they were doing some of the hallucination sequences where that guy's head was like jiggling back and forth because they would crank down the frame rate and then play it where he's like tilting his head like this, and then they'd play it in 24 frames per second, and it would look like he's going really quickly. Freaked me out, but that's a good one. So here's a modern horror that I guess it'd be kind of horror. It's more of like supernatural or science fiction. Even is a Stranger Things. I think it's a great show. I think it's. I prefer the first season. I think it should have ended there. I think the other subsequent seasons should have been like other stories. Because when I first saw it, I was anticipating it to be kind of like an anthology, kind of like American Horror Story, which I have not seen, so I can't put that on the list. But what would be really cool if Stranger Things had done like each season was like a new, really weird story. Like the first one with like the kid trapped in the dark dimension. Second one, could be about the superhero kids who all have different techniques, and they're maybe taking down some shadowy government. But like, so what I'm saying? Like every one has a different kind of story, and maybe they can connect sort of. But the fact that they kept in the upside down was starting to get old. I'm like, all right, got the Demigorgons, we got that weird spider thing. We've seen it all. We don't need to continue it. Let's add more things to it. So maybe Stranger Things season 4, which currently at time of airing this has not been released yet. So we'll see. Maybe once it's done, and I'll come back to it and comment on this for this list. But for right now, yeah, I think that just the first season of Stranger Things is pretty good. I really like it. The kids actors were great. Cool concept. Yeah, enough of Stranger Things. Next one would be Halloween. I think that one's, like I said about Psycho, it's definitely kind of started the slasher genre. I wouldn't say I'm like the biggest fan of this movie. It's not like this masterpiece in terms of filmmaking, but it is a cultural phenomenon. I mean, it literally started a genre of slasher films. And to this day, I really think that's the best one. I don't think any movie has really topped it. Yeah, I really can't think of anything that's like a straight up slasher movie because honestly, I don't really like slasher movies to begin with. I don't really like the concept of them. I'm not someone who enjoys people being murdered one by one in increasingly graphic ways, especially when it goes into like the Friday the 13th movies. I don't know. I just find it mean spirited. That's why horror is not the genre that I go to most often, especially nowadays. Movies are just something about them are just cold and mean spirited, and I don't know. But yeah, slasher movies just that. If I was going to say pick one slasher movie that I could watch, it's Halloween. That's up there. Okay. There's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I guess is kind of maybe even an earlier precursor of slasher films. But that one is just more of just like a wacky. That one gets weird. Like a lot of people remember that as like this really gritty, movie where people were being like just chopped down one by one. But there's some really odd scenes in that movie that's why I wouldn't really put it on a list of like my top. I'm only mentioning it now because, you know, I guess it has been influential. But there's like a scene where there's like a vampire. The old man is like a vampire who's sucking the blood out of the girl, and there's a scene where she's running through the woods and for like 20 minutes, just keep running and screaming, running and screaming. And the scene just kind of goes on and on and on. At one point, it just becomes kind of funny. So a lot of people remember that movie for the opening part or the first like quarter of the movie. But after that, the movie gets really just kind of hokey. I do like the ending shot though. The ending shot with Leatherface with the chainsaw swinging in front of the sunset. So it's a pretty cool shot. But otherwise, wouldn't really say it's like the best horror movie of all time. What are some other ones? Oh, Black Swan. Again, not a straight up horror movie. It's more of a psychological horror movie, kind of in the vein of Jacob's Ladder, where it deals with the horror of your mental state. And she's spiraling into this obsessing over the role of the dance, the ballet that she's a part of, and it just starts destroying her life and gets into some pretty surreal scenes. So I would say that definitely would consider to be a horror movie. Very good. One that I forgot on my science fiction list that I'd like to add to my horror list, because even though it is kind of a combination of horror and sci-fi, I think I should have put it on the science fiction list, but I'll put it on this list. Predator. Everyone I know has seen Predator. It's like the most universal sci-fi action horror movie that there is, aside from Aliens. And I remember this is the first movie that I'd seen. This is the first R-rated movie that I had seen. I was a kid, and I was at my friend's house, and they were showing me this scene where the Predator is like, he's already got the log on him, and he's got like the laser sight, and open the thing up, and you see the countdown. And I remember just kind of like, what is this? It wasn't until like 5 or 6 years later where I actually watched the full movie. And when I watched it that time, that inspired me to make my own movies, just like Aliens did. Those two, I think, are to thank for my physical inspiration to make movies. Those are the ones that actually, when I saw those movies, I got up and I grabbed a camera and started filming it. It was King Kong, I think, that really started my love for movies. But Aliens and Predator were the ones that actually got me to make movies. So yeah, Predator, wonderful, really hokey movie. There's a lot of parts of it that are so 80s over the top that I can't really call it like, it's definitely an 80s movie. There's some great effects, but just something about it is definitely, there can be some hokey scenes in there. I can't really think of one off the top of my head, but it's still good. No doubt there. Another one would be Night of the Living Dead. I would actually include all three: Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and The Day of the Dead. Not because I think they're like the best movies ever, but they're the movies that disturbed me the most. Like actually made me like creeped me out. Especially Day of the Dead. That one, there's a scene in that movie that to this day I can't watch. It disturbs me too much. There's a scene where a guy gets his head pulled off, and as it's being pulled off, his vocal cords are stretched, so his voice gets higher as it's being ripped off. And just hearing that sound, oh God, even thinking about it just really creeps me out. But I'm not a huge zombie fan in general, but those ones are good. But yeah, I think in general, like zombie movies, I mean, what else can you do with the genre? There's Walking Dead. There's the Night of the Living Dead. There's the 28 Days Later, which is probably the best version of a zombie, most realistic one. But again, like I'm not a huge fan of violence, especially that kind of violence where people like eating each other and ripping each other apart. I don't know. I like action, and I like when there's like a goofy violence. But when it's so brutal and disturbing, it's not fun to me. It just comes off as just mean-spirited. So, not a huge fan of zombie movies. And also the concept. What else can you do with the concept? I find it like kind of weird, like the idea of like these flesh-eating zombies. Like if they're eating all this flesh, where is it going? Is it just like filling their body up until they eventually pop like a balloon, big bloody balloon? I mean, I think about a little probably too deeply into it than I should have, but there's thoughts still come to my mind, like what's keeping them walking around? What's keeping them eating? What do they have a digestive tract? Again, it's just it's an overthinking a silly concept, but it's a silly concept that is so popular that it does kind of it warrants questioning. Thankfully, in the last couple of years, the zombie genre has kind of died off. Um, Walking Dead, I think, killed it. Ever since Walking Dead, no one has done really any big zombie movie. It's like, okay, we're done. We've seen enough. So thankfully, but at the same time, like hopefully that will stay for a while. Maybe another 15 years, the zombie genre will return and it'll be fresh again. But for right now, it's over. It's done. Anyway, back to my list. Godzilla, and I'm going to include all of the Godzilla series in this, not because they're horror films, but just because I love Godzilla. Godzilla was the first series that I became obsessed with. I was a kid. I think I was about 5 years old. Maybe I'd seen King Kong at the time, but I just remember watching Godzilla and just being infatuated with it. Just like the idea of a giant monster grabbing buildings and breaking them apart and battling other giant monsters, which is so cool to me. To this day, I still love Godzilla. I don't necessarily love the Godzilla movies of the last couple of years. I think the remake in 2000, the 90s one was okay. A lot of people hated that one. I thought it was fine, but it wasn't Godzilla. It was Beasts in 20,000 Fathoms remake. If they had just called it that or called it something else, I would have been fine. The fact they tried to call it Godzilla is the problem that I have with it. What they should have made originally was the 1994 Godzilla. If you read the script it's somewhere online, it's great. It's probably the best Godzilla like iteration of an American Godzilla that we'll ever have. However, the writer of that original, the 1994 version, went on to write King Kong versus Godzilla, which or Godzilla versus King Kong, which I just love that movie. It's so goofy, but it's the last two movies in the franchise, the 2014 and the 2019 one, took it so seriously. It's Godzilla. You're supposed to be having fun with it. And so the King Kong one, Skull Island, was okay. I thought the dialogue was really poorly written, but it was still cool visuals. But Godzilla versus King Kong was amazing. I loved it. It's not a good movie, but it's so fun. It knows exactly what it is. What that movie reminded me of is when I was a kid in my backyard, in my woods, and I had a Godzilla toy and a King Kong toy and had them fight. That's what that movie reminded. It reminded me of like if I had a bunch of money as a kid and I got to make the movie that I would make as a kid, and that's what that movie feels like. It feels like a 5-year-old told the director what to make, and he just made it. So it was fun. I love that one. So yeah, Godzilla is those ones are not necessarily horror, but I think the one that is a horror is the original. The original one is pretty grim. I know there was the theory that it was kind of a metaphor for the Hiroshima bombing, but which disturbing in its own. But also just they show like the implications of what a giant monster attack would be like, where we see the people who are affected by this and the how horrifying this would be if this giant unstoppable monster attacked your city. So yeah, the original Godzilla. That's a pretty freaky movie that people don't really talk about as much. What are some other good horror movies? Rosemary's Baby is not necessarily one that I think is as good as people say it is. It's okay, but it's not as good as like The Exorcist. It's not even really that scary. I don't think. Maybe I need to give it another watch. I don't know. But it just when I first saw it, didn't really do a whole lot for me. But I'll add it to this list just to have it. Whatever. What are some other ones? Shaun of the Dead. More of a comedy in terms of, but that's the only other zombie movie that I can say that I would feel comfortable adding to this list. But not because it's a horror movie. It is more of a comedy. But I'll mention anyway. American Werewolf in London. I think that's probably the best werewolf movie. I know the original Wolfman is, it's a classic, but this one truly is like I think the best iteration of the idea of a werewolf. I know the same year they had like The Howling and Wolfen, but those were not as good. American Werewolf in London is a great movie. Creepy and also a little bit funny. It's kind of like in a way, kind of a dark comedy, which I always appreciate dark comedy. And you get into some more like the more weirder movies. Dead Alive, Peter Jackson's, who was the creator of obviously, Lord of the Rings and King Kong. His first start of movies was in, the 80s and 90s, where he would make like these gore fest movies. He did two of them. Actually, I guess kind of three, but he did Bad Taste in 87, and he did Meet the Feebles in 89, which is a whole other thing. And then in 92, he did Dead Alive. And this movie, to this day, is the most graphic, disgusting movie I've ever seen. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not someone who loves violence. But this one, it was so over the top and so goofy, it honestly topped Evil Dead. Like, because he was just trying to gross us out. He was not trying to scare us in one night. He wanted to make us laugh and disgust us. There's two scenes in this movie that I have to skip every time I watch this movie because they're so disgusting. There's a scene where they're eating like custard, and the zombie lady has got like this cyst on her hand, and she's like Spider-Man squirting, instead of webbed, it's pus, and in this guy's bowl. And as he's eating it, he doesn't realize that there's an ear and the pus, and he's just eating that, and it's like, oh god, it's disgusting. Then towards the end of the movie, I don't know if I should spoil it. That's not really a plot point spoil. It's more of just like a spectacle spoiling. The son gets eaten by his zombie mother, who grows up to be like this giant zombie kaiju, and eats him. And he chops his way out of her stomach, and just this lava just pours of intestines just pours out of her along with him, and just a bath of disgusting goo. That movie smells like, I watch a movie and it feels like it stinks. It's an unpleasant movie, but it's so fun that I have to mention that one. What are some other ones? Invasion of the Body Snatchers actually is a really good, scary sci-fi movie. I would say that's, in terms of like, besides Alien, that might be my favorite. Well, I guess Alien the Thing. This would be number 3 in terms of top alien sci-fi or alien horror. Because this one is probably the creepiest of the one, because it deals with like paranoia and thinking that you're talking to someone that you recognize, and realizing that they are not. They are something from outer space, and find that really creepy concept. Because what's creepy about that concept is, this might be going too divergent here, but I feel like I've seen people like that. I feel like I've been on the bus with someone and talked to them and start wondering, are you really a human being? Because the way you're speaking, just something is off. Something about the look of them just feels off, like maybe that their skin wasn't settled right on their body, and it just kind of twitching. So yeah, that movie definitely made me kind of paranoid, which is supposed to. It's supposed to kind of give a sense of paranoia. So very creepy movie. What are some other ones? Misery. That's a good thriller. It's more of a thriller, but it's got some. It's enough scare in there that I think would put it in horror. I think I'll kind of wrap it up at this point, but I want to list one more that I'm not sure what genre you can put this in, but I'm going to put it in horror just because it creeped me the hell out, and that's Eraserhead. David Lynch's Eraserhead, 1977. That movie, I don't even remember how I discovered this movie. I just remember watching it at some point, just kind of waking up and it being in front of me, and having no idea what I was seeing. I thought it was made by some kind of demented person, and then it turns out it's made by this man named David Lynch, and he has went on to make many other films, a lot of great films, and a lot of movies that kind of are in the same genre of, is this horror? Does this belong in a horror category? Because they're so creepy. Some of the images in these movies are so creepy, especially Eraserhead, that in a way they might fit horror. And I wonder, if David Lynch were to make a straight up horror movie, I feel that might be one of the most frightening movies in history. I don't know. I don't think he's interested in that. I think he's more interested in like the subconscious, and not so much like, outright frightened. But they're still scary nonetheless. So yeah, that's my horror list. If you guys have any other horror lists that you or horror movies that you might want to mention to me, go ahead and send them my way. Give me a comment, give me a like, give me a subscribe, and keep watching for some more content later down the road. All right, take care.